Hi, folks. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Good afternoon. It's great to see you all here. Thank you, despite it being so beautiful outside. Thanks for coming in here with us. My name is Dan Hill. I'm the director of Melbourne School of Design, which is the graduate school here in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. It's a real pleasure to welcome you today to this keynote lecture for BLAK, Defining an Australian Design Future, as part of Melbourne Design Week, which is now on all over the place. Before we go any further, I'll do this and acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples and Bunurong peoples, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and respect the role of Indigenous knowledges within the Academy as well. I'm delighted to introduce the Dharawal and Yuin designer, artist and cultural leader, Alison Page. That's not Alison Page, that's me. I'm at least one step behind on the slides, apologies. So Alison is, as I said, a designer, artist and cultural leader, and she's here as the 2026 Robert Garland Tresidder Fellow in the faculty here. Just briefly on the fellowship, the Robert Garland Tresidder Fellowship enables international designers, architects, policy innovators, entrepreneurs, inventors, etc., with a strong commitment to design-led innovation, to visit and engage with the faculty, the university, and I guess the city and beyond. It's the largest philanthropic donation in the faculty's history, actually, and has had a transformative impact on the way that we work and learn. Fellows present public lectures and exhibitions and workshops and engage with staff and students, develop new work within the school, culminating in exhibitions like Alison's upstairs that many of you will have seen on the way in. In the past few years alone, we've had innovative and provocative public talks and events led by fellows, each of which is a global leader in their field, as is Alison. From the likes of people like Indy Johar, Philippe Ram, Sarah Ichioka, Mio Suniyama and Fuminori Nusaku most recently, and now Alison herself. Robert Tresidder is also alumni, a planning graduate here of the University of Melbourne, and taught here as a lecturer as well for a while. So we're immensely grateful for your generosity, Bob, and continued support. And we're especially pleased that Bob can join us in the audience today as well. A word of thanks also to Associate Professor Gillian Wallace, who co-curated the exhibition with Alison and helped shape the generous program of engagement around it, including this talk, and Jen Zielinska, the Manager of Engagement and Partnerships, and of course the whole exhibition events and installation teams that help make the exhibitions upstairs happen, as well as events like this, and everything else we do around public engagement. A word on Alison. She continues in that tradition of brave, inventive and innovative workers, designers, speakers, figures here. As you'll see in the gallery upstairs, her work nimbly sidesteps any attempt at classification or categorization. And in this, it's the best kind of design. It describes a kind of thinking through doing and making itself. In our work here at the school, I'll often quote the architect Denise Scott Brown, who wrote, "Architects and planners, whether they design buildings or recommend policy, are involved in doing. Therefore, architectural and planning education requires training for doing." And that statement relates closely to one that Alison wrote in the book with Paul Memmott, that many of you will know, First Knowledge is Design Building on Country, where they write, "Aboriginal architecture is a verb, not a noun, and it is in the doing that you understand it." The show upstairs is full of artifacts, but if you engage with it deeply, you feel it as well as see it, you'll see that that reveals the kind of patina, if you like. The traces of the doing is very clear within it, as again with the best kind of design, which sort of reveals the seams of its activity. Design building on country is powerfully reflective and generative, outlining design principles and practices that weave in and out of Indigenous knowledge systems and could equally through contemporary Australia's infrastructures of everyday life. These ideas are more relevant than ever now, for 5 years on since that book was released. We have not closed the gap, far from it, in fact. When Alison describes, for instance, the exemplary connecting to country framework in New South Wales, she makes explicit one of its perhaps implicit purposes to shake up the architecture world in Australia. which she points out is stratified by the privilege that marks Australia's inherent and deep inequality. In this, architecture and design is a reflection of its society. Design embodies what we stand for. It creates settings, experiences, encounters for us to encounter broader societal ideas, whether climate and its relationship with materiality, social justice, or indeed the richness of first knowledges. In particular, inspired by the work of Alison and all the recent Treasured Fellows, and you might see a theme emerging across that set, we are reorienting here what we do around making and reconnecting to materiality, recognizing that building on country means a reintroduction of material provenance to the built environment itself. And that work is political, social, and cultural all at once, integrated in a way that Indigenous knowledges would probably never separate out into those different English words. So finally, as Alison suggests, this is also a kind of new Australian design, as she puts it in the book. And she writes, "There is a new awakening fueled by ecological necessity to redesign our future and the relationship that we as people have with nature and each other. We can design our built environments to be part of managed landscapes that formed the basis of First Nations ecology since time immemorial. Our objects, interiors, and places can be an extension of the songlines that crisscross this country in every direction and are a web of knowledge embedded in our everyday lives. This new Australian design will improve the well-being of people and create places that ultimately mean more to all of us. It will extend country, not abrogate it, and it should be created with that in mind, because we are all connected to country." With that, I'd like to personally thank Alison for her work, the diversity of which we see but a trace of in the exhibition upstairs, and for spending the time and energy and wisdom with us all this week. And if you'd like to please join me in welcoming Alison Page to the stage.
Thanks very much, Professor Dan. I think he's just said everything I was going to say. So thanks for coming, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going home now. Thank you for the acknowledgement of country. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet. The Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. We're here talking about country after all and how our built environments are an extension of country. It is an honour to be here with Bob and to be named as the recipient of the 2026 Robert Garland Treasured Fellowship, which is funding design innovation. And it's such an important thing because there's actually there's so little of this kind of thing supported in Australia, and it's actually the voice of designers that we need more than ever now. I made a point in my at the opening yesterday, because Marcia Langton was in the room. I said, let's just buy a middle management and just replace the government with designers, which I'm hoping she'll run with that. I'm going to share with you my vision for an Australian future. And it is an Australian future fueled by design and accelerated by blackness. And it'll be all aspects of design, whether it's architecture, it's landscape architecture, it's fashion design, it's making and craft. But I have to talk about the future. So this is where the music gets a little dark. Design is never neutral. So we need to use design as an act of power to respond to the things that are happening in the world today. Design does carry the imprint of our culture and the memories of our culture and our values. And so we need designers to kind of respond to some of these worrying trends. Of course, we know a lot about climate change, so I'm not going to go too heavily into this, just to say that designing with country is about drawing on the wisdom of country and traditional owners who have adapted to major climatic changes. And it probably is the foundation. Sustainability is probably the foundation of designing with country. Placelessness. I mean, we travel around the world, we go to shopping malls, we sort of know where we're going inside shopping malls, no matter what city we're in, and that's a bit of a worry. There are a lot of design speakers too that are talking about this homogeneousness in architecture. And, you know, some architects will just continue to just kind of do the same buildings, shape making, plonking buildings on top of country without any sort of care for the distinct identity of the neighbourhood. But I think designing with country is really allowing architects to almost approach these projects like an artist, where you would do the research, the proper research on, and its site evaluation isn't just about looking at the sun, the wind, you know, or even the vernacular of the architecture around. It's actually about the history, the memory of place, which I'll go more into. I'm sorry to put this up here. I mean, can you believe it? Last night I did mention Pauline to Marcia, and it got her fired up. Of course it would, because, you know, she actually wrote a great article recently in the Saturday paper about how it's kind of the lack of political courage mixed with conspiracy theories plus pure racism that is just allowing this to happen again in Australia. You know, it takes us back to, you know, and in the exhibition downstairs, I actually map when the history wars were taking place and the anti-immigration sentiment that had started in the late 90s and went all the way through those 11 years of Howard. But social cohesion is under threat. And designers, especially landscape architects, who are designing public spaces that need to be activated, are in an excellent position to be designing for social cohesion and belonging. I'm also heavily triggered by some of my slides. I don't want to swear either. It's so early in the talk. But truth is under threat. And we need design because the media, design can give voice to stories. We can embed the truth of our history in our built environments so that when anyone is on their morning walk, they're walking through that building every day, you know, they're seeing the truth in their face. And the thing is, no one's really checking that with you. It's only your client you have to get it past, which is not that hard. So, so I think about, you know, the design of the National Museum of Australia by Ashton Raggett McDougall, ARM, when they put sorry all over the building in Braille, and John Howard, when he found out about it, came along and got some of the dots removed. I mean, they just should have said nothing. Just stay silent on it and put it in there by stealth. But the truth can be told through the built environment. Sorry. I mean, I've got so much to say about this slide, but I will say that not only has Amazon opened a major distribution centre outside every Australian city and probably every city in the world, which has killed retail, and retail has been sort of the driver of activation of many public spaces, urban spaces, and the cities. Now is the time to actually think maybe these retail spaces need to be cultural infrastructure. Maybe we need to get our cultural institutions outside their walls and get into these spaces and activate them. That is an opportunity. And Temu, which the image I got here from the BBC was from an article called Temu is Addictive as Sugar. I mean, what they actually do, because I have a friend who's an artist who was rung up by a client. She makes beautiful tufted works that are incredible, a lot of work. They're all made of wool. They take hours to make, days actually, and months to make these works. She was asked for some high-res images because him and his wife would like to buy some of her works. And the next, probably about a month later, she found her works on Temu for sale. So that's why they sort of have, I've often thought, well, some of the stuff is really aesthetic. And when it's a tiny thumbnail, you know, on your feed, you're thinking, wow, they've got someone in there has an eye, but they're actually stealing the work of artists from all over the world and encouraging slavery. And then we've got the AI revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, and in particular generative AI, which is being heavily debated in creative circles, I believe will create an arts and craft movement, as it did in the late 19th century and as it will now. The human-made, the handmade, the authentic will be more valuable. And so that's why all of those problems kind of lead to this. This is where we come in. Again, we have a blueprint for a new Australian design that's based on some very old ideas. And I want to talk to you about our beliefs, because Aboriginal culture has some very deep beliefs that are embedded in our three-dimensional world and also everything we make and build. And it's this idea of country, which is more than just nature. Yes, it is the land, the sea and the sky, but it is everything we make and build as well, and our cultural practices. I want to talk to you about the dreaming. So the dreaming refers to a time in the ancestral past when the world was occupied by ancestral beings. They were dreaming heroes. I guess superheroes, really, in some instances, because every nation in Australia has these stories of these incredible beings. The earth was liquid, was seen to be liquid. And these ancestral beings would travel up through the earth and they would shape landforms. They would travel across the earth and they would leave their tracks, their paths, their knowledges behind. These ancestral beings were part animal, part human, and part plant. So you'd have the kangaroo man, the yam woman, or the lightning man. And they would, when they died, their ancestral spirits went into the earth and they left their perpetual energies at different sites all over the country. So we can go to these sacred sites and conduct ceremony and awaken these perpetual energies. So we might go to the lightning place to increase lightning. We might go to the rain place to increase rain. We might go to the kangaroo place, conduct ceremony to increase the population of kangaroo. But the dual identity of these ancestral beings when they died split. And so plants became plants, animals became animals, and humans became humans. But depending on where your country is and where those perpetual energies lie, some of the energy of that elemental force or that animal or that plant would stay in the human, and some of the human energy would stay in those plants and those animals. And that's where our totemic relationships were set up. I wrote a book with Paul Memmott, who is an incredible thinker, and he has taught me so much about this. And he goes deeply into how any ancestral, this is just a small part of Sydney, which would have been one clan area, the Gadigal people, which is the grass reed people of the Sydney CBD. But it would have just been one family group that had the responsibility to look after a number of different species, but particularly the Gadigal reed and the Tank Stream Valley, where it grew and was part of their land where the tank stream was. So this is, I guess, what the dreaming is really all about. And the story of these ancestral beings are still taught today. So they are elaborate stories. Like we've all heard of the stories of the Seven Sisters dreaming, which is a story of 7 sisters who were a constellation of stars, but at different times in the story they turn into plants and animals. And they're being chased by an evil man, Wadinieri, who has a giant penis and he's chasing them, and all sorts of drama and you know, there's highs and lows in the story. And I'll explain why the stories need to be elaborate when I talk about songlines. But as people moved across country over time, they are continually remembering these stories. And people cared for it, cared for the plants and animals because they had that intimate relationship like it was family. And when you understand the stories of the place where you live or your home or the river that you live on, then you will truly belong there. And that's a very interesting idea for us as Australians to get our head around too, because I think part of the reason why we have an obsession with real estate is that we want to belong here so badly. But we don't have to belong just by owning a home. We belong here through story, through sharing story, through connection, through ceremony, through this idea of the dreaming and how we can all tap into it. And it is a cultural landscape. So when we talk about songlines, it's sort of an extension of those stories I started talking about. This was the way that we remembered the vast amounts of ecological and cultural data that we needed to survive. So a constellation of stars might be on the horizon at a particular time of year, and that might tell you when there's a grease on top of the ocean and the sharks are breeding. And then another thread goes to like a group of plants that are ready for harvest and ready to eat. And they're threads. They're invisible threads that join different parts of the landscape. And they change and move as the climate changes and moves. I mean, this is an image of Sydney Harbour, which 10,000 years ago was a valley, a river valley. And then it was inundated with water. And so the community had to change and adapt their stories because the ecological knowledge that they needed to survive had to change. But it's a mnemonic learning, which different cultures have. I know the Turkish have memory palaces. And the way it is a very effective way of remembering. You know, I'm trying to learn a language at the moment, and so I'm putting stick-it notes all over the house. And so every time I walk up the stairs, I look at that bit of knowledge and I think about that word. And then the next day I can add another word and another word and another word. And that's how songlines work. And they're highly effective. And then when you start, that's the oral history part of it. But then when you start adding song, symbols, dances, stories, the remembering is greater. And apparently this type of learning, which is very well described in Mark O'Neill and Lynn Kelly's book Songlines, it can be very good for your brain health as well. But it's a very interesting thought for us as designers to think that our three-dimensional world, okay, so if the built environment is an extension of country, and Aboriginal people embedded stories across the Sydney or the Melbourne cultural landscape for millennia. First of all, how do we tap into those existing stories? But how can our new surfaces that we're putting in place be a voice for the Library of the Dreaming in the future? And it may not just be ecological knowledge, it can be anything. I know that there are schools in Victoria that Lynn Kelly is working with where they're embedding the curriculum around the school. So the children learn about history, by walking through the school. And when they're in the exam, their minds go back to that place, which is how a lot of Aboriginal artists work. When they're painting their travelling country. And then we go to objects. So objects too are an opportunity to record data. They become sites of learning in their own right. So this is a still from a film from 1973, Frank Gumanamana in Arnhem Land, who is making a fish trap. It's a beautiful film. I think they still have it on display at the National Museum. And as he's making the fish trap, he's talking to the fish trap ancestor, the dreaming hero, that created all of the areas around Arnhem Land where they could go fishing. And he's saying, and you created this place where I can catch this fish. And he's talking to it intimately, like it is a person. And so the maker or the artist is simply a medium through which the ancestral beings are speaking. And the object becomes totally vitalised. It becomes a ceremonial object. Just remember Timu now. And just how absolutely opposite that is. And to this throwaway society that young people, you know, we've all inherited now, really, where you don't just have one lamp or one bedroom side table or a great lounge that you bought in your 20s and you have for the rest of your life. No, you have 10 of them and you chuck them out. You know, that idea is horrific. As it is, you know, why would you walk into a library and start burning the books? You know, we would not destroy any of these objects. And, you know, I sort of think a good touch point is family heirlooms. You know, they become the person who you inherited it off. So every time you walk past that precious object, you know, you might even touch it and caress it and say hello to it and speak to it. It becomes totally, it's not an inanimate object anymore. It's animated. It's animate. It's full of spirit. It's full of energy. And, you know, there is a lot of theory around this. Blackfoot physics in Canada looks at the relationship between quantum physics and Aboriginal belief systems. Because these objects, not only do they have those perpetual energies of the ancestors, but they are documents. They become more, so the patterns and the etchings and the carvings that you put into them are more than just decoration. They must be, because there's so many stories the world needs to hear. And we need to tell all of the layers of history, from deep time to now. And we do, you know, when we go into a project. This project, I was asked to do a plaque outside the New South Wales Parliament. And they literally wanted a bronze plaque with English words on it, which I can't believe they asked me to do. So I made this work with a ceramicist, Simon Rees, and a culture and heritage expert, where we imagined just taking a core out of the ground underneath where Parliament was and placing it on top. So there's a sandstone layer, there's a layer of middens, there's a layer of fire, there's all of those stratified layers of our history. And so when we go into these projects, we're always looking at the memory of country. So BLAK, the reason why I've sort of gone and defining this designing with country through the lens of blackness is because I really loved this work that Destiny, it wasn't this particular work, she's been doing, this is a work from 2020, but she's been doing this idea of black artwork since the late 90s, but it's a reclamation of the deep belief system that I just explained, but Aboriginal people today, it is the world's oldest living culture. And so this idea that we're continually bringing it together with the contemporary world is very much a social justice idea, really. And I really relate to it in terms of the contemporary context we must bring it into. It's got to be a part of just Australian culture. It's got to be a part of Australian society. Otherwise, it's only creating more division. So that's why the Designing with Country movement needs to be taken on by every designer and client and user of public spaces in Australia. So Designing with Country has kind of revolutionised, really. Well, it is transforming. I don't think we're there yet in terms of its potential, but certainly every state significant development that's happening in New South Wales must adhere to the guidelines, which demands that the teams have a conversation or a dialogue with country, which means engaging with the traditional owners. It's probably a whole nother lecture that I could talk to you about with how communities are organising themselves in terms of cultural governance because of these new laws coming out around Indigenous intellectual culture and intellectual property that are probably coming out this year, federal laws, because of native title, because of the requirements in environmental laws, the EBPC Act, that requires people to get permissions from traditional owners or to have dialogue with traditional owners around the management of land, because it does prevent big fires, it does prevent major floods. That we, you know, has it been perfect in New South Wales? No, it hasn't. It's only 6 or 7 years old. But certainly I can speak from the point of view of a traditional owner from Sydney. My community are starting to organise themselves in a major way to get, like they're starting a Connecting with Country, a Designing with Country division of our traditional owner corp. So I think that will take off around the country. So I just want to talk to a few projects of how this is happening. Country. So when we go into a project, especially a project like this at Bays West, and Annie Tennant's in the room from placemaking, she's actually my client, so I'm feeling a little bit of performance anxiety right now. Just correct me if I'm wrong, Annie, on any of this. And I know they're old renders as well, but I'm just, yeah. But this is the site where White Bay Power Station is, which was a coal-fired power station, and it's on the shores of Balmain. We went in and had a look at what the original landscape was like. There were whole islands that were just blown up. Like, it was so augmented that to bring back original shorelines or anything like that was pretty much out of the question. So, but there's a freshwater creek that is running through the site. And I feel like half my life is about freeing the creeks from their incarceration in drains. Just around the bend from this, there's a creek right next to the Sydney Fish Market. It's called Stormwater Drain number 17. And so, yeah, I won't be happy unless it's got a new name and it's been freed. But anyway, I feel like I spend a lot of time looking at stormwater drain maps. Hang on, I've gone back. Wait, how do I accidentally pressed a button and now I don't know how to go back. The little one? Am I going back? Oh, yes. Well, that was intuitive. Thank you. So we look at what country needs. And I showed a little picture of a fragile animal, the white seahorse, which Annie thinks that I've got this totemic relationship with it because I bring up the seahorse in just about every meeting. And then my Indigenous, like my First Nations colleagues on the team also say, you know what, Alison, there's more than just the seahorse in Sydney Harbour. There's other species. There's like seagrasses and stuff. But I like the idea of a simple proposition. You've got a multi-billion-dollar development. I don't know how many apartments are going into it, just a lot. New school, parklands, new metro, you name it, it's massive. What if it could do some heavy lifting to protect or become an increased site for the white seahorse? So back to my diagram with the perpetual energies of all the answers. You know, what if this became the seahorse place? And the people of Balmain and this area of White Bay were invited to be the seahorse people and to care for the seahorse like it is, they have their energy inside the seahorse and the seahorse has their energy inside them. That perhaps, you know, not only do you have to care for the water, so we're creating parklands where the top metre of the high tide is being cleaned every 12 hours through salt marsh channels, which creates great definition in the public space. But perhaps, you know, of course, we're building new motels for the seahorses, which we found out they love shopping trolleys, which have been thrown in Sydney Harbour, because they need these hotels called filthy motels, which I also love. But that's because they've so many little bars in the shopping trolleys that they get all of the wonderful moss growing all over it, and that's great habitat. You can see I'm not a biologist, right? I've already lost you. But great motels pinned to the wall so that we can encourage the seahorses to really get it on and reproduce. And that perhaps, back to activation, we could, and you know, there is fantastic, you know, one, Annie's team has done award-winning projects in the White Bay Power Station around arts. It will become an arts precinct. And perhaps one day we'll have a seahorse festival. But I love the idea too that if people, when they're on their morning walk, on their morning run, perhaps there will be this marine knowledge that is unfolding to them every day as they walk through this place and become embedded in this place. But of course we need our people. This is the Gamay Rangers who have this amazing sea country plan. This is a mob from my community. They have trained marine scientists in their team, looking after country and coming up with new programs. And, you know, part of it is, you know, providing apartments for them to live in this space. Annie doesn't know this yet, but I think it's about giving black people some places to live on country where they become urban rangers, so that you aren't just kind of relying on them to come in and look after someone else's country and then drive an hour and a half back home. Truth-telling, as I said, is going to be incredibly, I think, important, especially in this age. And that there's so many chapters in Australia's true history that have not been told. This is a work I made at the site of Cook's Landing called The Eyes of the Land and the Sea. And when I was commissioned to do it in late 2019, I worked with my community. We did a lot of the research. I actually spent some time to read Cook's diaries. I think he's given a bad rap. Banks is actually the real villain in the story. But, because Cook actually did get it. You know, he writes this chapter in his book about how, you know, we were the happiest people he'd ever witnessed. The land and sea provided us everything that we would ever need. And, you know, not to forget he was a working class man, you know, so he, you know, the airs and graces, and of course having to put up with Banks with his 3 little puppy dogs on board. He's probably over it. And, you know, just thought, yeah, you know, why can't we all just go and do boating, camping, fishing, you know, forever and live by the sea like these happy people here. But anyway, there's a lot of amazing stories in Australia's true history, and this is one of them. So there was always a plaque down at Cook's Landing place, and it said, Cook was met with the words, Wada Wada Wa. And, you know, he's not totally innocent. He actually shot at some of my ancestors on the day because they couldn't speak the same language. And he was frustrated, wanted fresh water, etc. Not making excuses for him, but I'm just saying. Context. But what I was tasked to do was to put, I think, a counterpoint to this obelisk which recognises Cook. You know, there's a lot of colonial, it's all about balancing, right? So it's called The Eyes of the Land and the Sea because this is about the view from the ship and the view from the shore, which were always just seen as two opposing forces, where I think there's actually more crossover than we recognise. And I think it's about finding that. Like, for instance, when I started looking at a cross-section of the Endeavour itself, the ship, and I overlaid it with the bones of a whale, which is our totem, and was the thing that actually my people thought it was. When they saw the ship sailing in, they thought it was a whale. And they thought that Cook was the reincarnation of one of their whale spirits that had died and come back with white skin. So, interestingly, depending on where you're standing, you either see the ribs of the Endeavour or the bones of a whale. And it sits in the tidal zone between the ship and the shore where our Australian identity lies. And so a lot of the time it's covered up with water and then it's revealed. And I put some of some of those quotes that I really liked from Cook's diary inscribed in the bronze. It will be there for a very long time. And it corrects the truth of Wadawaddawa, which is not go away, which it had been translated to before. It was dead, dead, they're all dead, because my people thought that these were ghosts. And every community, I made another film called The Message with all of the communities up the coast, all of them thought that these were ghosts that were travelling up the coast. And of course, they were all waiting for him as he travelled to Cooktown and Possession Island. And ceremony, you know, activation, a massive opportunity to counter Pauline Hanson and her ridiculous politics of populism. Ceremony, and I love this quote from Wesley's book. Wesley also wrote a book in the same series on ceremony. Ceremonies help form deeper and stronger bonds between people in a community. And in return, the greater the bond, the more likely you are to rely on that community in hard times. Shared moments bind a culture together through generations and help build a social cohesion that is essential in times of threat. So we need ceremonies and we need them now. And, you know, in Wesley's book, he does draw a line between funerals, birthdays, Christmas, Easter, you know, our everyday ceremonies, but how we can design new ceremonies that can be place-based. This was a beautiful event that Emily McDaniel curated at the 2018 Sydney Festival called 4,000 Fish, which talks about a day when 4,000 fish were caught in Sydney Harbour by the white men. You know, the population of Sydney at the time was only a few hundred, and they caught 4,000 fish. And then they took the biggest fish to the men of the tribe, which was just the biggest no-no because the women, Barangaroo herself, was in charge of fishing and was in charge of the food supply. So Emily designed a beautiful ceremony where you could go down to the water, collect some salt water, take it up to the cutaway, put it into fish-shaped moulds, which went into large freezers, and then you could take a pre-frozen one back down to a coulerman, a big giant coulerman that was designed by Lucy Simpson, and it was on a fire that would never go out, and the fish could be melted back into the earth, into the ocean. So it is a way of engaging young people, particularly in our true history, through doing, through experiencing, and through immersion. Another one of my projects with Annie Tennant Sorry. And working with the Sydney Fish Markets and Aspect Studios is the Sydney Fish Markets, which has been just such a success. And, you know, you go there and talk about a success in social cohesion. You know, you just see not only people who live and work in Sydney enjoying the best breakfast on earth down there at the Sydney Fish Markets, but it's also become a major destination for internationals who visit, who want to understand a little bit about who we are and our culture. And for them to see multiculturalism and joy and our love of seafood, and also this kind of invitation to be saltwater people. It's almost what the space does. And so I designed a water play area with Aspect at doing the landscape, and I want it fully integrated into the landscape. I don't have the image here, but I totally ripped it off. This day at the beach I had where the pippies were coming up through the sand as they do, and this beautiful shellfish was just making this incredible pattern. I had to do that and celebrate it. It's called Land of the Giant Pippies, and I programmed the water to kind of be like a set rolling in, which, you know, the kids love it. They think they're at a rave. They're just like, go psycho when the waves get bigger and bigger. Look at this. Yeah. But, you know, and I did my job. I fulfilled the brief. I could have just moved on, but no. I'm sort of harassing placemaking and the Sydney Fish Markets to do a ceremony at this place. And we want to call it the Pippi Cook-Off. And we want to invite different cultural groups, give them the same stock, some of the base ingredients, but get them to bring their cultural flavours to bear and make their favourite Pippi recipe. So our Pippi curry, which I think will win, except I'm a bit worried about the XO Pippis because I think they're amazing. We had some last night and they're incredible. So you'll have Italians with their vongole pasta, XO Pippis, and just have a playful cooking competition on a day where we can all come together. There'll be a big long table, a big auntie's table, and we can break bread together and share. And if we kind of can think about events like this, you know, these are the types of things that, so the spaces that we design, and this is why if I had my time again, I'd probably be a landscape architecture. And I'm looking at you, Alan, because I said I wouldn't say that, but I am saying it. But because you have the power to actually also just go that little step further and design the event that happens in the places that you build. And we have these also opportunities for news stories. This is a work I've just completed at the Westmead Children's Hospital, which was, the brief was to do an interactive work. And again, I looked into the history of the site and realised that where Westmead Hospital is at Parramatta, it used to be covered in these endangered Sydney blue gum high forests. And obviously it's just a concrete jungle now, like there's hardly any of it left. And so I worked with the elders there, the Darug elders, and we wrote a children's story about these magical creatures that would come back and inspire the kids to come closer and look inside these little creatures that would fly around. And it was like the ancestral beings were sending out these little creatures to get the kids to care for country as they had. So we wrote this beautiful children's story, and we're inside. They are rewarded when they go up close to these bronze lights, bronze and acrylic lights, because inside are these seeds that were painted by Aboriginal kids at the Nepean High School, Arts High School, and they're these gum nut seeds. And so the lights in the creatures become brighter as they come closer to them. But, you know, we're working with the hospital, hopefully to do a children's book. Hopefully that is given to every sick child when they go into the hospital, and they can colour in their little creatures and really immerse themselves in the story. And finally, objects. because I only have 5 minutes left. But this is a range I did with Breville, and it's really, you know, I spoke deeply with Marcia about this last night, that really, whether you're painting on the body, whether you're painting, as we know, we can wrap our objects in country. And so I worked with Papunya Tula artists. These artists had walked out of the desert and saw a white man for the first time in 1983 to wrap these everyday items in country. So the coffee machines, there was a men's ritual coffee machine and a women's ritual coffee machine. The toaster became all about ancient grains and the cool burning of ancient grains by Lucy Simpson. The kettle became about medicine. You know, Yakulti Napangadi, when we launched these in Harrods in London and Bloomingdale's in New York, she goes straight up to the object and she started singing the song. So it was completely, even though this is a limited batch and, you know, there were multiples of these, it still carried the potency of the original painting. So we know we can do this. We know we can take these items into into probably not mass production, but small batches, and they still hold that potency. And this is where our House of BLAK comes in, which you've all seen upstairs. I hope you go and see it. But the manifesto was kind of written with my good friend Courtney Gibson and Stephanie Sims. We sat there thinking about those problems of the future and what would be our manifesto, what would be the thing that we would want to do if we started designing custom elements within interiors or architecture, or doing limited runs of things. And it's all about this: blackness, the power of story, authenticity, strength in numbers, honouring craft and honouring sustainability. And this is about really, I think, our arts and craft movement in Australia and how Aboriginal storytelling can be a powerful way of reinvigorating new industries and our creative industries. Jobs for artists, really. And this is the work of the beautiful Sansia Ridgway, who does work in yarn. She's incredible and she's an up-and-coming designer. And we need more up-and-coming designers, which is why I'm working here with the Melbourne Design School and our Institute for Designing with Country at UTS, where I'm a professor of practice, where we run studios, freeing creeks, like in this project. And just lastly, this one student is looking at, she's a landscape architect, architecture student, but her whole project is about giving legal status to the creek, which is in a drain. I love that. So thank you very much for listening, and please follow the House of BLAK.
Thanks so much, Alison. As you can see, I've got scribbles left, right and centre on here, and I'm not going to try and do justice to your talk in any way, but just to say thank you so much. I feel like some of those earlier slides perhaps needed some trigger warnings. Trump's press secretary and the person whose name I'm not even going to say. I spent most of my life trying to avoid saying Margaret Thatcher's name, but now I have to avoid saying that name. So anyway, but after that, it was just such a beautiful, optimistic, hopeful and constructive in the best sense, kind of weaving together of so many things. I've just scribbled down truth is under threat, but then linking to truth-telling, from AI to a new arts and crafts movement, which funnily enough some of us have been talking about recently, but then connecting that to blackness in Australia. Incredibly profound, the idea of more than human, landscape itself, and also the sense that landscape requires activation and time-based thinking, which extends the idea of design well beyond where it usually is. Somehow connecting Temu and toasters and trolleys, all in one talk. Freeing the creeks, bring it on. And belonging is more than owning a house, which I think is that's a good name for a studio. Anybody wants to do that next semester. So yeah, look, I'll ask you to all join me in thanking Alison again in a moment. But before we go, just a couple of announcements, I think. So So as you will have clocked by now, there is an exhibition upstairs, and please do see it if you haven't already, and tell your mates and your family and everybody to come on down. It's on until the 16th of July. It's Alison's first solo exhibition, I believe, so it's incredibly powerful, and thanks again to those in the faculty, Gillian and Jen and Wendy and others who, and the whole team there have helped put that together as well from in-house. We've got MSDX Winter coming up. I don't know if that's on the next slide. Not quite. Anyway, so MSDX is our end of semester show, which is basically all of the work that the staff and students have done over the semester. That'll be numerous projects that reimagine the built environment from many different angles through installations, models, drawings, videos, and others. And then I just gave you a brief glimpse of what's happening on the 8th there. So we've got the next Dean's Lecture coming up on September the 8th. The award-winning and quite brilliant Bangladeshi architect, Marina Tabassum. So please come back for that. And it's followed by the opening of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture exhibition. So thanks for coming. And please join me one more time in thanking Alison Page for her fantastic talk.